someone you loved is gone, and yet there are moments when it doesn't feel that way at all. You catch yourself about to call them with a piece of news. Before remembering, mid-thought, that you can't, you feel a strange, unmistakable sense that they're nearby, in a room at a specific hour, during a specific song. You talk to them sometimes, quietly, in your head, or even out loud, without fully deciding to. This isn't rare or unusual. Almost everyone who has lost someone close to them has some version of this experience. A smell that stops them in their tracks. A coincidence that feels too specific to be nothing. A dream that felt different from ordinary dreams, more like a visit than a story your mind made up. These moments tend to arrive uninvited at ordinary times, and they rarely announce themselves as anything dramatic. They just quietly insist that the person isn't as absent as the world keeps telling you they are. Most people don't admit this openly. There's an unspoken rule that grief is supposed to resolve into acceptance, and acceptance is supposed to look like letting go completely, closing the door, moving on, treating the person as fully, permanently absent. If you still feel their presence months or years later, some quiet part of you starts to wonder if you're doing grief wrong, if you're stuck, if you should have moved past this by now. But here's the question almost nobody asks directly. What if that feeling isn't a malfunction? What if the sense that someone hasn't fully left isn't denial, isn't unfinished grief, isn't a sign you need to let go harder? What if it's actually a reasonably accurate perception of something real? There was a civilization that built its entire relationship with death around exactly this idea. Not as comforting fiction, not as a poetic way of talking about memory, as literal structural belief. They didn't think the soul simply departs and severs all contact the moment the body dies. They believed part of it stays, connected, present, requiring ongoing care, ongoing attention, an ongoing relationship, not a one-time goodbye. And it's worth asking, after thousands of years and radically different tools for understanding the mind, does modern psychology actually agree with them? Or does it confirm what most of us have quietly suspected? That the sudden, total severing we've been told is healthy was never quite right to begin with. Let's start with what they believed actually stays behind. What's easy to miss is how recent our current cultural script actually is. For the overwhelming majority of human history, in the overwhelming majority of cultures, nobody expected a clean, total break from the dead at all. That expectation is a strange modern invention, and it's worth asking exactly where it came from and whether it was ever actually correct. There's something worth sitting with here before we go further. This isn't really a question about the afterlife in some abstract theological sense. It's a question about what actually happens in the mind of someone who has lost a person they love, and whether the version of healthy that most of us were taught was ever actually correct. None of what follows requires you to believe in an afterlife or to adopt any particular religious framework. It simply requires being willing to ask whether the discomfort our culture attaches to this feeling was ever actually earned. Consider how strange it actually is that we've built an entire cultural expectation around a feeling most people secretly don't share. Ask around, quietly, among people you trust, and you'll likely find that almost everyone has their own private version of this. A specific memory that arrives with such force it feels less like recall and more like contact. A word or phrase you find yourself using that isn't yours, borrowed unconsciously from someone gone. A physical sensation of being accompanied during a hard moment with no obvious source. These experiences rarely get compared out loud, which means most people quietly assume they're the only one holding on to something everyone else has properly released. In ancient Egyptian belief, a person wasn't understood as having just one soul, but several distinct components, each with its own role and its own destiny after death. One of the most important of these was called the Ka. The Ka is often translated loosely as a person's vital essence or life force, but that translation undersells how concretely the Egyptians treated it. The Ka wasn't an abstract spiritual concept floating somewhere undefined. It was believed to remain tied to the physical body and its resting place after death, not departing for some distant afterlife realm the way other components of the soul might, but staying local, staying connected, staying, in a very real sense, at home. Egyptian art often depicted the Ka as a kind of double of the living person, sometimes shown as an identical figure standing just behind or beside them, representing this second aspect of identity that existed alongside the physical self, even during life, not just after death. The Ka wasn't something that suddenly appeared at the moment of death. It was believed to be present the whole time, simply changing its relationship to the world once the body it was tied to stopped living. Because the Ka was believed to remain with the body, it was also believed to require ongoing sustenance, just as a living person requires food and drink. This wasn't treated as symbolic or ceremonial in the way we might assume today. Egyptian families brought real offerings of bread, beer, meat, and other food to the tombs of their deceased relatives, not once but repeatedly, sometimes for generations. Specifically so, the Ka would continue to be nourished and would not go hungry in its ongoing existence beside the body. This is why Egyptian tombs were built the way they were, not just as burial sites, but as functional dwelling places for a presence the family believed was still, in some sense, there. Wealthy tombs included entire chapels attached to the burial chamber, specifically for family members to bring offerings on an ongoing basis, sometimes staffed by dedicated priests whose entire job was to maintain that relationship long after the family itself had died out. And this is also, in large part, why mummification mattered so much. Preserving the body wasn't only about respect for the deceased in some general sense. It was understood as maintaining the physical anchor point the Ka needed in order to remain present at all. A destroyed or decayed body risked destabilizing that ongoing connection entirely. The elaborate, expensive, meticulous process of mummification was, at its core, an act of maintaining a relationship the Egyptians believed hadn't actually ended. This is also why tomb robbery was treated as such a severe transgression in Egyptian society, going well beyond simple theft. Damaging or disturbing a body wasn't just a crime against property or even against the memory of the dead. It was considered an attack on an ongoing, active relationship, capable of genuinely harming a presence the family believed was still there, still dependent on that physical space remaining intact and undisturbed. Which raises an interesting question. If the relationship with the deceased wasn't believed to end, what did ongoing contact actually look like in practice for an ordinary Egyptian family? As it turns out, there's a genuinely strange piece of evidence that answers this question directly. It's worth noting that not every family could sustain formal offerings indefinitely. Over generations, resources and attention naturally shifted, and many tombs eventually stopped receiving regular visits. But this practical limitation didn't reflect a weakening of the underlying belief. Wealthier families sometimes endowed dedicated mortuary priests, called K-priests, specifically to guarantee that offerings would continue even after direct descendants could no longer maintain them personally. A kind of institutional insurance policy for an ongoing relationship the family didn't want to see lapse. Modern visitors to Egypt can still see the physical evidence of how seriously this relationship was maintained, offering tables carved directly into tomb walls, designed specifically to receive food and drink on a recurring basis, some inscribed with the deceased's name and titles, so the connection would remain personal and specific, not a generic gesture toward the dead in general. Archaeologists have recovered a genuinely remarkable category of ancient Egyptian document, known today as letters to the dead. These are exactly what the name suggests. Physical letters, written by living family members, addressed directly to a specific deceased relative and left at the tomb, sometimes placed inside the offering bowls used for the food left for the car. These weren't vague expressions of grief or generic prayers. They were specific, practical, often surprisingly ordinary in tone. A surviving husband might write to his deceased wife, asking her to stop troubling him in dreams. A widow might ask a departed spouse to intervene in the dispute with living relatives over an inheritance. A parent might ask a deceased child for help protecting the rest of the family from illness. One well-documented letter complains in essentially domestic terms about problems within the household and asks the dead relative to intervene the way any living family member might be asked to help settle things. Some of these letters even take a slightly exasperated, almost scolding tone, reminding the deceased of everything that was done for them while they were alive, and asking in return why they haven't been more helpful from wherever they now reside. This is a strikingly intimate, unguarded way of relating to someone who has died. Not the careful, respectful distance we might expect from a formal religious document, but something closer to a real, ongoing, occasionally frustrated relationship between two people who still expected things from each other. Think about what this actually implies. These letters only make sense if the belief behind them was genuine, ordinary, and unremarkable to the people who wrote them. Not a special ritual performed only in moments of extreme crisis, but a normal, almost mundane way of continuing to include a deceased relative in the practical business of family life. You don't write a detailed complaint about a property dispute to someone you believe is entirely permanently gone. You write that letter to someone you believe is still listening, still capable of acting, still part of the household in some meaningful way. This connects to another important concept in Egyptian belief, the Ak, where the Ka represented the vital force tied to the body and tomb. The Ak represented a more active, transfigured state. The deceased person having successfully completed the necessary rites and now capable of interacting more directly with the world of the living, sometimes for protection, sometimes for guidance, sometimes, as these letters suggest, for fairly ordinary problem solving. Becoming an Ak wasn't automatic. It required the correct funerary rites to have been properly performed, echoing the same theme we've seen elsewhere in Egyptian belief. Precision mattered. A poorly conducted burial, or a family that failed to maintain the necessary offerings, risked leaving a relative in a kind of unsettled state, neither fully at rest nor fully able to help, which gave the living a very concrete, practical incentive to maintain the relationship carefully and consistently, not out of vague sentiment, but out of real concern for the deceased's ongoing well-being and their own. The overall picture that emerges from Egyptian religious practice isn't one of death as a hard boundary, severing all contact. It's closer to a continuing relationship, requiring maintenance, communication, and mutual obligation. The living feeding and honouring the dead expected to look out for and occasionally intervene on behalf of the living. Death changed the terms of the relationship. It didn't end it, which brings up an uncomfortable question for anyone raised in a modern context. If continuing this kind of relationship was completely normal for one of history's most sophisticated civilizations, why does modern culture treat the exact same instinct? Talking to a deceased loved one, feeling their ongoing presence, maintaining an active emotional bond as something to eventually grow out of. There's one more detail worth including here, because it complicates the picture in an interesting way. Not every letter to the dead is warm or grateful in tone. Some are openly accusatory, blaming a deceased relative for a run of bad luck or illness in the family and asking them to stop causing harm from beyond the grave. This matters because it shows the relationship wasn't idealized or purely sentimental. It was treated as a real, sometimes difficult relationship, capable of the same complexity, frustration, and negotiation you'd expect between two living people who depended on each other. For much of the 20th century, mainstream Western psychology operated on an assumption that would have seemed strange to an ancient Egyptian family, that healthy grieving requires detachment. This traces back significantly to Sigmund Freud's concept of grief work, which proposed that the psychologically healthy path through loss involved gradually withdrawing emotional investment from the deceased, so that energy could eventually be redirected toward new relationships and new attachments in the world of the living. Continuing to feel closely bonded to someone who had died in this framework was treated as a sign that the necessary emotional work hadn't been completed yet. For decades, this assumption shaped how grief was clinically understood and treated. Continued conversations with the deceased, a persistent sense of their presence, an ongoing emotional relationship. These were often framed as things a person needed to eventually move beyond in order to be considered fully recovered. Then, starting in the 1990s, a body of research began to seriously challenge this model. Psychologists studying grief across large populations found something the older framework hadn't predicted. People who maintained an ongoing sense of connection to a deceased loved one, continuing to talk to them, sense their presence, feel guided by their memory, were not on average worse adjusted or more psychologically troubled than people who didn't. In many studies, they showed comparable or even better long-term emotional adjustment. This body of research eventually became known by a specific name: continuing bonds theory. Researchers working in this area have documented a wide range of ordinary ways people maintain these bonds. Talking to photographs, marking anniversaries with specific rituals, sensing a loved one's guidance during difficult decisions, even simply continuing to ask internally, what would they think of this before making a choice? Rather than treating these behaviours as red flags, contemporary grief researchers increasingly treat them as part of a normal, adaptive process of integrating loss into an ongoing life, rather than something a person needs to be cured of. The core finding, now widely accepted within grief psychology, is that maintaining an ongoing bond with someone who has died is not inherently a sign of unresolved grief. For many people, it's simply part of a healthy, adaptive relationship with loss, a way of integrating the person into an ongoing internal life, rather than being required to sever the connection entirely in order to heal. Now hold that next to what Egyptian families were doing thousands of years earlier, with no psychological research, no clinical studies, no theoretical framework, beyond lived experience and careful observation across generations. They built an entire structure: tombs, offerings, letters, ongoing communication, around the assumption that the relationship with the deceased continues, and that maintaining it is not a failure to move on, but simply the correct expected shape of love after death. This isn't a claim that Egyptian belief and modern continuing bonds theory describe identical mechanisms, but the underlying instinct is strikingly aligned. Both landed independently on the idea that severing all connection to someone you loved isn't necessary for a healthy life afterward, and maintaining that connection may be exactly what a healthy relationship with loss looks like. It took modern psychology the better part of a century and a significant course correction to arrive at a conclusion Egyptian families seem to have simply taken for granted. It's worth being precise about what this research does and doesn't say. Continuing bonds theory isn't a claim that grief has no difficult stages, or that intense pain after loss is somehow avoidable. It's a more specific correction: the idea that healthy resolution of grief requires complete emotional severance from the deceased simply isn't supported by the evidence. Connection and healing, it turns out, were never actually opposites. Some researchers in this space distinguish between bonds that are healthy and adaptive versus bonds that become distressing or interfere with a person's ability to engage with ongoing life. The distinction isn't simply any connection is good. Connection itself was never the accurate marker of unhealthy grief. The older model assumed it to be. What matters more is whether the bond brings comfort and integrates into a full life, or whether it's tangled up with unresolved guilt or an inability to function. A more nuanced picture than the old assumption that any ongoing attachment signaled a problem. Part of the answer is simply timing. Continuing bonds theory is a relatively recent correction within psychology, but the older detachment model shaped popular culture for decades before that correction gained traction. Movies, self-help books, even casual conversation absorbed the older assumption that moving on meant closing the door completely, and that framework doesn't disappear from a culture's instincts just because the research behind it eventually changed. So people are often left carrying two contradictory messages at once: a cultural script that says True healing means fully letting go, and a private lived experience that keeps quietly disagreeing with that script. The result, for a lot of people, is a private sense of failure attached to something that isn't actually a failure at all. Feeling embarrassed or stuck for continuing to feel connected to someone, when the honest current research suggests that connection was never the problem to begin with. This gap shows up in small everyday ways that rarely get discussed directly. Someone quietly puts away a photograph after a certain amount of time has passed, worried that keeping it visible signals they haven't moved on. Someone stops mentioning a deceased parent in conversation, sensing that others have grown uncomfortable hearing about them. Someone feels a flicker of shame after realizing they still, years later, sometimes speak to an empty room, as if the person could hear. None of these instincts are irrational. They're simply responses to a cultural expectation that, according to the research, was mistaken from the start. There's also a broader modern discomfort with death itself that compounds this. Many contemporary societies have pushed death further out of daily life than almost any culture in history. Fewer people die at home. Fewer people are involved in preparing a loved one's body. Mourning periods are shorter and less structured than they once were. Compare that to Egyptian society, where tending to the dead was a normal, recurring, almost domestic task, built into the rhythm of family life, rather than compressed into a brief period of acceptable grieving before returning to normal. The Egyptians didn't need a research correction to arrive at this. They simply never adopted the assumption that needed correcting in the first place. Their relationship with death was structured around continuity, not severance. And if anything, modern psychology has spent the last several decades finding its way back towards something closer to what they already understood. There's also a quieter cultural factor at play. Modern life is often structured in ways that make sustained mourning practically difficult. Bereavement leave from work is typically measured in days, not seasons. Friends and extended family, however well-meaning, often expect a return to normal conversation and routine well before an internal sense of loss has actually settled. None of this is anyone's fault specifically. It's simply the shape of a culture that has, in many ways, streamlined death out of everyday rhythm, leaving individuals to privately carry a bond that once would have been supported, expected, and structurally accommodated by the entire community around them. There's a strange irony worth noting here. We live in an era with more tools than ever to preserve someone's presence after death. Photos, videos, voicemails, text message threads that remain scrollable years later. And yet the cultural permission to actually use those things, to stay connected, to revisit them without shame, hasn't caught up with the technology. We have more ways than any generation in history to keep someone close and still feel oddly apologetic about doing exactly that. Even the language we use reveals the assumption baked into modern culture. We talk about grief in terms of stages, implying a linear process with a defined endpoint. We talk about people who are still grieving years later, as though a clock is running and a buzzer should have gone off by now. Compare that to a culture where feeding a deceased relative's spirit for decades wasn't considered still doing anything unusual. It was simply an ongoing part of family life, no more remarkable than continuing to celebrate a living relative's birthday year after year. Egypt's letters to the dead and continuous tomb offerings are some of the clearest documented evidence of this instinct in the ancient world. But the underlying pattern, maintaining an active relationship with deceased loved ones, rather than treating death as a total severing, shows up across an enormous range of cultures, with no direct connection to Egypt or to each other. In Mexico, the tradition now widely known as Dia de los Muertos treats the boundary between the living and the dead as something that opens, rather than something permanently closed. Families build altars, known as ofrendas, featuring photographs, favourite foods and personal belongings of deceased relatives, welcoming their spirits back for a specific period each year. This isn't treated as a sombre, fearful occasion. It's celebratory, warm and social, built on the assumption that the relationship with the deceased is ongoing and worth actively maintaining, not something to be quietly left in the past. In Chinese ancestor veneration practices, many households maintain a dedicated space, sometimes as simple as a small shelf or altar, where photographs or tablets representing deceased family members are kept, along with regular offerings of food, incense, or symbolic items. Important family decisions are sometimes still discussed, at least informally, with a sense that ancestors remain aware and invested in the family's well-being generations after their death. In Japan, the summer festival known as Obon is built around the belief that the spirits of ancestors return each year to visit their living relatives. Families clean and decorate graves, prepare special meals, and in many regions light lanterns specifically to help guide these visiting spirits home and later back to wherever they came from, treating the visit as temporary, expected and welcome, rather than as some rare or unsettling exception to how death normally works. None of these traditions developed with any meaningful contact with ancient Egyptian religious practice. Different continents, different centuries, different cosmologies entirely. And yet the same underlying instinct keeps appearing. The relationship with someone you loved doesn't have to end simply because their life did. That kind of independent, repeated convergence across cultures with no way of comparing notes is difficult to dismiss as pure coincidence. It suggests something genuinely human is being recognised here again and again, regardless of who's doing the recognising. It's also worth noticing what these traditions have in common structurally. Beyond the basic instinct to stay connected, nearly all of them build in specific repeated actions. A meal prepared, a grave cleaned, a lantern lit, a letter written, rather than treating the bond as something purely internal or emotional. There's a shared wisdom here that connection tends to be sustained through action, not just feeling, doing something, however small, to actively maintain the relationship, rather than simply hoping the feeling of closeness persists on its own. Even within cultures more commonly associated with a stricter letting go narrative, quieter counter traditions often persist beneath the surface. Visiting a grave regularly, keeping a loved one's belongings deliberately unchanged, marking a death anniversary each year with a specific meal or gathering. These practices exist in many Western families too. Even in cultures whose official psychological and religious narratives emphasize moving on, the instinct toward ongoing connection seems to survive even in cultural contexts actively working against it. Even the specific objects used to maintain these bonds echo each other across cultures in ways that feel almost too consistent to be accidental. Food, light, and the written or spoken word show up again and again as the primary tools for reaching across the boundary of death, regardless of which civilization or century you're looking at. There's a reason these traditions have proven so durable, surviving colonization, modernization, and enormous cultural pressure to abandon them in favor of more rational approaches to death. They answer something people clearly need answered, generation after generation, regardless of what official religious or medical authorities say should happen instead. A tradition doesn't survive for centuries by accident. It survives because it keeps proving useful to the people actually living through loss, year after year, family after family. Before going further, it's worth being clear about something important. None of this is meant to minimize grief that feels overwhelming, complicated, or genuinely difficult to carry. If loss is affecting your ability to function in daily life, that's worth discussing with a professional who can actually support you through it. This video is exploring history and psychology, not offering therapy, and there's no substitute for real support when grief becomes that heavy. With that said, for the ordinary common experience of continuing to feel connected to someone who died, sensing their presence, talking to them, keeping their memory actively woven into your life rather than sealed away, the first thing worth taking from all of this is simple permission. You don't need to treat that connection as something to eventually outgrow. Both a multi-thousand-year-old civilization and current psychological research seem to agree. Maintaining the bond isn't the problem. It may simply be what love looks like after death, structurally, rather than a stage you're failing to move past. The second thing worth considering is more active. If it feels meaningful to you, there's nothing irrational or embarrassing about creating small, intentional rituals of connection. Keeping a photo somewhere visible, marking an anniversary in a specific way, mentally checking in with someone during a big decision, the way Egyptian families once left offerings or wrote letters. You don't need a religious framework to justify this. You're simply doing, in your own way, what humans across nearly every culture in history have found meaningful enough to formalize. The third thing is about how you talk about this with other people, especially anyone who might see continued connection to a deceased loved one as something concerning. You don't need to over-explain or apologize for it. You can simply hold, quietly and confidently, what both ancient wisdom and modern research already point toward. This isn't a sign that something is wrong with you. It's evidence that the bond mattered enough to survive the one thing that was supposed to end it. There's a fourth thing worth mentioning, borrowed directly from what these traditions all seem to share. Specificity helps. A vague sense of staying connected tends to fade faster than a concrete, repeated action does. Choosing one small specific practice, lighting a candle on a particular date, keeping a particular object somewhere visible, writing an occasional letter you never intend to send, tends to sustain a felt sense of connection far more reliably than simply hoping the feeling persists in the background of an ordinary week. Finally, it can help to remember that this isn't a permanent, unchanging state either. The nature of a bond with someone who has died often evolves over time. The sharp, constant presence of early grief usually softens into something quieter more occasional, more woven into ordinary life rather than dominating it. That evolution isn't a sign the connection is fading or being properly resolved in the old sense. It's simply what a living relationship, even with someone who is gone, tends to look like as it matures. None of these suggestions require anyone else's approval or understanding. If people in your life still carry the older assumption that healthy grief means moving past a connection entirely, you don't owe them a defense of your own experience. You're allowed to simply know quietly that you're standing on solid ground, historically, culturally, and now scientifically as well. It's also worth extending this same permission to how you relate to other people's grief, not just your own. If someone in your life still talks about a parent who died a decade ago as though they're still consulting them on decisions, or keeps a plate out at holidays for someone who's gone, the most useful response isn't concern about whether they've processed the loss correctly. It's simply recognizing that they're doing something humans have done for as long as we have any record of human behavior at all. So go back to that quiet, complicated feeling we started with. The sense that someone who died hasn't fully left. The impulse to talk to them. The certainty in unguarded moments that they're somehow still present. An entire civilization built its religious life around treating that feeling as accurate, not as something to overcome. They fed it, literally, with offerings left at tombs for generations. They wrote to it, addressing letters to relatives they believed were still listening. They structured mummification, tomb architecture, an ongoing ritual around a single core belief. The relationship with someone you love does not end simply because their body did. And now, after a century spent insisting the opposite, that healthy grief required cutting that connection cleanly, modern psychology has quietly walked its way back to something remarkably close to where the Egyptians already stood. Continuing bonds aren't a sign of failure to heal. For many people, they're simply what healing looks like. If you've ever felt embarrassed for still feeling connected to someone who's gone, you weren't imagining something broken in yourself. You were, in a very real sense, in extremely good company, across thousands of years and across cultures that never once compared notes. Maybe the soul doesn't literally remain tethered to a tomb, the way the Egyptians believed. Maybe there's no car waiting quietly for an offering, no letter that actually reaches anyone. But the underlying pattern, that connection, can outlast a body. That love doesn't require an ending, just because a life did. Keeps showing up everywhere humans have looked closely enough to notice it. In religion, in ritual, and now finally in the research too. Whatever ends up being true about the exact mechanism, one thing seems clear across an ancient civilization. A dozen unrelated cultural traditions, and decades of careful psychological research. The instinct to stay connected to someone you loved was never the thing that needed fixing. If anything, it may be one of the most quietly reliable signs that the relationship mattered exactly as much as it felt like it did. If this changed how you think about the connections you still carry, do me a favour and hit subscribe. We go deeper into what ancient wisdom actually understood about the soul and consciousness every single week. And I want to know, is there someone you still feel connected to, even now? Tell me about them in the comments if you'd like. I read every single one. whoever it is you're carrying with you, wherever they are, however you understand what remains of them. That connection has more history and more evidence standing behind it than the silence around it usually lets on. There's a kind of quiet relief in realizing you were never actually alone in this. Not in the sense of other people simply feeling sympathy for your loss, but in the much more specific sense that entire civilizations, entire families across thousands of years built their whole understanding of love around the same instinct you've been quietly, privately carrying, often while wondering if you were the only one still holding on this tightly, this long, this specifically.